Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 4 in Unit 2 in our series on political science. This lecture is going to be on structural liberalism, also known as neoliberalism. Um, and think of it in relation to liberalism the way neorealism was in relation to realism, in that structural liberalism sort of tries to take the ideas behind classical liberalism and sort of update it for more modern times. In essence, what it's trying to do is sort of take sort of the lofty ambitions of classical liberalism and sort of ground them and make them more reflective for a end of Cold War and post-Cold War reality. And so, just to recap the basic ideas of liberalism, liberals don't think that the world is as violent, as conflict prone as realists do. They think that, sure, there's violence in the system and there's opportunity for conflict, but there's also opportunity for collaboration. That's because the nature of power is not zero sum. And so there's scenarios in which countries can both benefit from collaboration, even though we can benefit in different ways. So the example I gave in our lecture on liberalism was NATO. Countries that are not the United States benefit more from the United States being in NATO than the United States benefits from other countries being in NATO. But that doesn't mean that the US doesn't benefit. It gains some benefit, even though the benefits are asymmetrical. Ultimately, the scenario that liberals want is a world where most countries are interdependent, that they rely on each other for a whole host of different things, such as military power, wealth, and markets. That makes conflict impossible because you cannot go to war with other countries without then damaging yourself. Liberals tend to focus much more on wealth, not just military capabilities. So that means that in addition to states, there's also a whole host of different actors, NGOs, MNCs, institutions, etc., etc. And we looked at all of those in our lecture on classical liberalism. And the textbook case that I gave, for example, is North Korea viewed by realists is a powerful country because it has a large military and it shows that it's willing to use it. And therefore, it's able to keep its independence from larger global superpowers like China, Russia, and the United States, all of whom it shares a border with, or at least in the United States, through allies in South Korea and Japan. Whereas for liberals, North Korea is a weak country because its wealth is not comparable to that of its neighbors, and wealth is far more useful than military power. You can have all the nukes in the world, but that won't mean anything if you can't feed your people. And so North Korea, according to liberals, is consistently weaker than South Korea because it refuses to be interdependent. So, what exactly should countries do? This is a key question that neoliberals try to ask. Because, classical liberalism is all well and good, and yes, countries should be interdependent. But what do you do in the meantime? How do you go around behaving in the world? Specifically, in a world where wealth is the metric, how do you project power on the world stage? And the solution that neoliberals come up with is soft power, which is basically any way that you can project power without using military power. So, what might be some examples? Well, how about this? The distribution of American goods and services worldwide. McDonald's, Apple products, all of this stuff. This is an example not just of American business, but American soft power. But also things like diplomacy and diplomatic efforts. There's a reason why the US State Department is the largest such entity in the world, because the United States spends lots of money with its State Department basically promoting a healthy, good image of itself. Things like the global supply chain, products made in America, or money coming from America to purchase products abroad. And lastly, the internet. This is perhaps the most indicative one of the 21st century. American cultural capital reaching across the world, and with that coming soft power. Now, there are two predominant theories in neoliberal thought. The first democratic peace theory, which is, well, if we're so interdependent, why do we go to war? Because war does exist. And lastly, democratic development theory. Why does democracy form in some places but struggles in others? We're going to try to answer both of these questions in order. So let's start off with democratic peace theory. This is the brainchild of political scientist Michael Doyle. And Doyle essentially argues that there is a bit of a paradox in how liberals conceive warfare. Because democracies appear to be simultaneously more peaceful and more war-prone, depending on who you ask. Like, depending on who you ask, democracies either go to war more or they go to war less. Why is that? Well, he starts off with this premise that capitalism and democracy are forces for peace. They are antithetical to imperialism. For Schumpeter, who is a German philosopher and political scientist who Doyle quotes a lot, the further development of capitalism and democracy will mean that imperialism will disappear. Only war profiteers and military aristocrats gain from wars. No democracy would pursue a minority interest and tolerate the high costs of war. When free trade prevails, no class gains from forcible expansion. The only real group that benefits from going to war is military contractors. It's war profiteers and military aristocrats, generals and whatnot. But the vast majority of people do not gain from wars of conquest. So, like, let's say, for example, let's use an example I used last time. Let's say the United States, in order to fill up its demand for maple syrup, invaded the province of Montreal and seized the maple syrup reserve, which, again, I want to remind you, is a real thing. That would not be good in a democracy, because the only people who would benefit from that sort of action are the people who provide the weapons and the people leading the army. For everyone else, it's far more advantageous to just buy maple syrup. And so when free trade prevails, there's no class of person that really benefits from seizing territory. This, however, contrasts with Machiavelli, who asks if democracies are imperialistic. Machiavelli argues that not only are republics not pacifistic, they are ironically the best form of state for imperial expansion. Because strength and then imperial expansion results from the way liberty encourages increased population and property, which grown when citizens know their lives and goods are secure from arbitrary seizure. Free citizens equip large armies and provide soldiers who fight for public glory and the common good because they are in fact their own. Essentially, the argument out of Machiavelli is republics, democracies have more money because people, population and property grow when people know that their lives and their goods are safe from tyrants. And because of that, they can equip large armies and provide soldiers who will fight for, quote, the public glory. This belief leads to liberal imperialism. We are lovers of glory, says Machiavelli. We seek to rule, or at least to avoid being oppressed. In either case, we want more for ourselves and our states than just material welfare. Now you may argue, well, are we really lovers of glory? To that, I would counter, yes, we are. We just call it the World Cup or the Super Bowl. You can see that sort of intuitively when you think about how much we can appreciate public glory. But is this still true? Well, Doyle says, we can conclude that either liberal pacifism has at least taken over the further development of capitalist democracy, or that the mixed record of liberalism, pacifism, and imperialism indicates that some states are Schumpeterian democracies, while other are Machiavellian republics. Essentially, maybe the answer is that some states are more peaceful, some states are more warlike. So, are democracies peaceful or imperialistic? Well, Doyle argues the truth is somewhere in the middle. You see, modern liberalism carries with it two legacies. They do not affect liberal states separately, according to whether they are pacifistic or, imperialistic, but simultaneously. Liberal states exercise restraint, and a separate peace exists among them. If liberal states, think about it this way, restraint, the ability to not use war as the first option. If liberal states use restraint when considering war as a tool, then each liberal state will not consider war against another liberal state. So let's say if Canada and the United States get into an argument, and war for the United States is the 10th option in the list of options, and war for Canada is the 10th option in the list of options, well then neither country will go to war. And so if you expand that concept, what you get is essentially that democracies do not go to war with each other. That's the secret. Every single war the United States has been in the 1900s and 2000s, none of them have been against democracies. Think about it. Not a one has been against a democracy, because democracies do not go to war with each other. And so, logically, as the number of liberal states increases, that announces the possibility of global peace. Because when states are forced to decide on which side of an impending world war they will fight, liberal states will all end up on the same side, despite how they get there. But of course, democratic peace theory only applies to democracies. Peaceful restraint only seems to work in liberals' relations to other liberals. Authoritarian rulers both stimulate and respond to an international political environment in which the conflicts of prestige, interest, and pure fear of what other states might do all lead states to war. And so we cannot simply gain warfare on the authoritarians or totalitarians. Most wars arise out of calculations or miscalculations of interests, misunderstandings, and mutual suspicions. So, liberal states invade weak non-liberal states, display a striking distrust in dealings with powerful non-liberal states. And this should seem true to you. So think about, for example, the United States' relation with Iran, specifically in regards to the nuclear deal. Iran says, we want to create nuclear energy for Iran, that's a prerogative of ours, and we do not trust them. Because in our mind, they are not a liberal state. They are not amongst the list of countries that we would consider Western democracies. Because of that, we don't trust them. And because we don't trust them, we get into conflict. But ultimately, the big takeaway out of democratic peace theory is that democracies don't go to war with each other. And in order to have global peace, it would be better for everyone if there were more democracies in the world. So, how do you develop a democracy? Nice segue. Seymour Lipset, again, talks about democratic development theory. And he asks himself two questions. Why does democracy develop where it does and how, in the manner in which it does? And what's the correlation between economic development and democracy? He says he defines democracy as a political system which supplies regular constitutional opportunities for changing the government officials. It is a social mechanism. That's important. It's a social mechanism for the resolution of the problem of societal decision making. Together, we decide who gets to make decisions. We just call that elections. The most widespread generalization linking political systems to other aspects of society has been that democracy is related to the state of economic development. Concretely, this means that the more well-to-do a nation, the greater the chances it will sustain democracy. Because the most important process underlying the development of democratic norms is the relationship between modernization and the form of class struggle. For the lower strata, economic development, which means increased income, greater economic security, and a higher education, permit those in this status to develop longer time perspectives and more complex views of politics. Now, if you're following, he said something a little controversial here. Because what he's saying is that it's not the poor who will demand democracy, nor is it the rich. Think about it. If you're poor, if you're trying to figure out how to survive tomorrow, you're not worried about where your rights are coming from. You're worried about how you're going to eat tomorrow. But if you're rich, you're probably benefiting from this non-democratic system as it is already. So instead, what you want is a middle class, a group of individuals that is just invested enough in the outcomes of their society to demand a say in how that society is run. So, for example, increased wealth is not only related causally to the development of democracy by changing the social conditions of workers, but it also affects the political role of the middle class. A large middle class plays a mitigating role in moderating conflict, since it's able to reward moderate and democratic parties and penalize extremist groups. A large middle class is not going to tend to reward a overtly communist or fascist party with their vote. Now, there are exceptions, but by and large, that is not the case. And so as a country's middle class develops, they will demand their rights and democratic rules. Now let's combine these two theories. Democratic peace theory. Democracies don't go to war with each other, and because they tend to go to war with non-democracies. And so the goal should be to have as many democracies as possible. And democracy forms when the economic conditions are right for it to form, which means that you want to have increasing levels of economic development, which form a vibrant middle class, more invested in the outcome of their societies. And so in order to develop democracy around the world, we should push for market-oriented economic development. Put the two theories together and you have a cohesive idea for what you should do. So let's ask it again. What exactly should countries do? Here it is. Democracy is a good thing. Democracies tend to be interdependent with each other, and they don't go to war. And so in order to make the world system more stable, we should have as many democracies as possible contained in the economic system. Economic development. It's a major factor in the development of democracy. And so we need to go around the world promoting markets and free market capitalism wherever possible, because that increases wealth. Wealth increases chances for democracy, and increased democracy leads to peace. Now, neoliberals try to do this through the use of soft power as much as possible. That's structural liberalism. That's neoliberalism. I hope that made sense. I hope that was clear. If you have any questions, you know how to reach me, and I will catch you in the next lecture. Bye-bye.